Well, thank you. It's my great pleasure, and good morning / afternoon, everybody. Please save some dessert for me. What I want to try to do is to make a few overview comments about effective leadership discussions at the senior leadership level, and I'll then suggest a little bit of research and follow-up, and then I want to open it up for your questions and challenges and comments. One of the things that I think we need to do is to add to the specificity of the conversations. And if you have the handout that I handed out, you'll see that paragraph 2 is talking about coaching conversations. Now, the questions that I have there are not exhaustive by any means, but I think they're significantly different from most coaching conversations that I've heard. By asking a principal or asking another colleague at the central office, what did you learn today? That ought to be a central question. One of the things I've been worried about is these ponderous mission and vision statements that go on for paragraphs. And I would love to see a mission statement that just says, everybody learns every day. And if we could model that in our leadership conversations by asking our leadership colleagues, what did you learn today about a student, about a colleague, about yourself? And those are 3 pretty short questions that ought to lead to, I think, some probing and reflective answers. And I suppose that you might get the answer, well, nothing. I've been too busy filling out reports for you, or some other kind of impudent response. I understand that. I just want to suggest that if you don't ask the question, you'll never provoke the reflection. And I think these kind of questions are significantly different than how's it going, what's going on, which almost always lead to a negative conversation about a problem that leads somebody else to put a monkey back on your back. You want to keep the conversation focused in a way that builds leadership capacity. So asking, what did you learn today about a student, colleague, or yourself could really be a very fruitful conversation. Then, depending upon the context, and I, of course, defer to your judgment on this, another coaching conversation is, what difficult issue did you confront today with a student, with a colleague, or with yourself? Oftentimes, I'll hear a coaching conversation that includes lots of complaints, lots of problems, but no resolution. And I think regular coaching conversations need to return to that and say, 2 weeks ago you said that you thought that the 3rd grade team was not very functional, or that the 9th grade algebra failure rate was way too high. We knew about that 2 weeks ago, so let's talk about what's happened on that specific issue in the last 2 weeks. What did you confront? Because if we're having the same conversations 3 months from now, then it seems to me it's a pretty one-way conversation and not helping. So big idea number 1 is, let's refine the coaching conversations about learning and confronting difficult issues. Big idea number 2 is focus. I remember having spoken when some of the focus research that I conducted first came out, and I was down in your neck of the woods talking about this. And I think it's important that I update you on what the research has said since then. The original research from more than 2,000 schools concluded that high levels of focus, and by that we defined it as 6 or fewer priorities, significantly outperformed schools, whether they were high poverty, middle of the road, low poverty, whatever the case was. The highly focused schools had significantly better performance in a variety of academic indicators. The problem is that everybody's out there trying to help you. Obviously, in a state that is known for its ed reform efforts, and you've been very successful, there are, at least to my outsider's judgment, lots of things that have been piled on, one after another, very well-intentioned, very well-meaning. But what people don't understand is, after piling those on, it looks like an archaeological dig at the classroom at the building level, with one after another after the other. So my hope is that you'll consider weeding the garden a little bit and talking about 6 or fewer priorities. Now, the other question is, so what's happened since this first study was published in 2010 and now? And I guess a couple of things that I would observe. Number 1, people talk about this more than they actually do it. They'll say, well, Doug, we'd like to focus, except the state made us do it, or the foundation funders made us do it, or the union made us do it, or whatever. There's always some external force saying you've got to do more and more and more. So I would just observe a couple of things that I've learned since this study was published. Number one, there's a significant disconnect between the perception of focus at the district level versus the classroom level. In one good-sized study that I conducted, I simply asked central office to say, what are your areas of focus? And they were able to, I don't know if they read my book or not, but they were able to give me 6 very clearly defined, thoughtfully expressed areas of focus. Then I said, I trust you, I respect you, I accept that, but I'm a researcher, so would you mind if I check? And of course I asked principals. They had significantly more than that. Then I asked teachers, and the number of initiatives that they listed that were priority areas, literally to fit on one PowerPoint slide required 6-point type. So I just want to respectfully say that it's not enough for the senior leadership to have focus if we don't also get very intentional at the building level and the classroom level about what we're not going to do. If you want to do Readers and Writers Workshop, that's great. God bless you, go do that. But you have to create time for that to happen, and that means talking about what we're not going to do. I've written in the past about the need for power standards, and that is the frank admission that nobody covers everything. And we can either decide what not to cover by default, whatever we don't get around to, or by design, having a few focused things that we do really well rather than so many things. The last thing I'll say on this area of focus, which I think leads to our conversation, is the same focus in leadership evaluation and teacher evaluation is an imperative. Since this study was published, everybody talks a good game about focus, and then they publish a telephone book to do teacher observation. And a legal pad full of leadership expectations that you ought to be doing these, depending on who you read, 21 to 70 things. And I think that's silly. We have to narrow our conversations on the things that really have an impact. And those kind of inquiries need to be the height of our observation and management system and evaluation system, not just one of many, many fragmented things. So, speaking of focus, where's one of the most important areas to focus? That's my third big idea for today, and that's feedback. Many of you I know John Hattie's work. He's spoken to this group in the past. John's a good friend of mine. If you read Visible Learning for Teachers, you'll see some of my work footnoted there. So you'll see a lot of compatibility between what John is saying and I'm saying. The problem that people forget when they look at John's list of all the things that might influence student achievement is that basically anything with a pulse can, quote, work, unquote. What the real question is not what works. I know the federal government means well with the What Works Clearinghouse, but that's candidly not very helpful, since so many things can, quote, work, because they use the standard of statistical significance. The standard that you and I must use is not statistical significance, but practical significance. Of all the things that have statistical significance, what are the few things that have practical impact on students in the classroom? And right at the top of that list is feedback. The acronym I'd like you to consider is taken from a new book that I just completed called FAST Grading. And FAST, F-A-S-T, stands for fair, accurate, specific, and timely. And by fair, I mean that the same kid receives the same evaluation. Seems pretty straightforward. You know, the same basket that goes into the goal gets 2 or 3 or 1 point, depending upon the context, but it's either in the basket or it's not. Nobody says, well, it was close, so we'll give you 80% of the points to which you might have been entitled had the basket gone in. It's there or it's not. That's the level of clarity that we ought to aspire to in evaluation of students and teachers and principals. It's got to be fair. It's got to be accurate, which means that the evaluation is related to the performance. And by that I mean, if I hadn't thought about this till just now, but I guess Kentucky is an acceptable place to use basketball analogies. If the ball goes into the basket, we don't say, unfortunately, son, you're not going to get those points because you didn't perform well in practice this last week. It went in or it didn't. Conversely, if the ball is an air ball and misses the basket, we don't say, we're going to award you points because of all the good things you did in practice last week. So the analogy is pretty clear. Too much of evaluation is based upon practice, what is often called homework, but I would prefer to call practice, rather than performance. So an accurate level of feedback is related to the performance at the end of the semester. And there are many distortions of accuracy that I think we need to confront. By specific, I mean the feedback is clear enough that it can be used for performance improvement. And when I ask principals to do assessments of effective feedback, I always ask them to start with a chorus class, a band class, some other music class, or an athletic practice. And the principal ought to walk in with two questions in mind. What percentage of students receive feedback? And of those who did receive feedback, what percentage of students responded to the feedback with improved performance? You know, if you go into a good music practice or athletic practice, the answer to both those questions is 100% of kids got feedback, 100% of kids responded to the feedback. You can hear it with your own ears, you can see it with your own eyes. Then go to a history class, then go to an algebra class and ask the same questions. What percentage of students received feedback? What percentage of students responded to it? And finally, fast feedback has to be timely. It's so immediate that students can associate the feedback with their performance. In a great practice, in a great classroom, that is measured in seconds. When we're talking about evaluation of teachers and of principals, I believe it ought to be same day. Take a cautionary tale from New York, where teachers and principals are getting feedback 90 days, 90 days after the observation was performed. That's never going to influence anybody's performance. It becomes one more bureaucratic drill. So the last big idea, and then I'm going to ask for your comments and questions, has to do with critical thinking, innovation, and creativity. The subject of my latest book, Inspiring Innovation and Creativity in K-12. I would just offer this. If we expect critical thinking and other 21st century skills to happen in the classroom, they have to happen in the cabinet meeting. They have to happen in the building leadership team meeting. I would argue they have to happen in the school board meeting. So a way of assessing critical thinking with everybody who works with you is to ask them to complete this exercise. I used to think, and now I think. That phrase is taken from the title of a wonderful book by Richard Elmore at Harvard. And I just start that exercise by saying, you know what, if Dick Elmore and other contributors like Howard Gardner are willing to say, I used to think, but now I think, then my goodness, the rest of us should be able to say that too. They weren't always right, and they admit that. I always try to start this conversation off by saying, here are things that I used to think, and now I think. Now, I will warn you that if you do that, what happens to you might be what happens to me. Some people will say, well, thank you for your integrity. Thanks for, we need researchers and we need professional developers who will talk about how they are learning and their learning is advancing over the course of time. But that's not always the case. Some people will say, well, if you were wrong 10 years ago, Doug, then why should we believe you now? And all I can say is beware the expert who is always conveniently right, who has never changed their opinions. So, look, I've been wrong about things like learning styles. I've been wrong about things like brainstorming, and I publicly write about what I used to think and now I think, and hope that people will regard that as a sign of learning and advancement, and as what all of us, no matter how long we've been in teaching and leadership, need to do. So when a superintendent can say, I used to think this about leadership, about learning, about teaching, but today I've learned some things in the last 20 years, and now I think, then I think you're opening the door to critical thinking for everybody else. I will die and go to heaven when members of Congress are able to say the same thing about educational policy. I guess one last thing. We talk a good game about collaboration as a 21st century skill. Honestly, almost no one is doing that. In an international study that I conducted of classroom assessments, a tiny fraction do collaboration at any effective level at all. Most often, students are urged to work independently, and there's a place for independent work. But we can't say in our mission and vision statements that we value 21st century skills of collaboration and critical thinking and creativity and then not do it in the classroom. So I think we need, again, to model that very explicitly. Collaboration does require joint contributions. It requires feedback. It requires an environment of debate and dissent and comparison and evaluation. One of the most important things that teachers can do is to have students get comfortable with debate and dissent and alternative points of view. That's one of the reasons that Common Core, and I realize there's a divergence of opinion about that, but I will tell you that one good thing you'll find in there is the significant emphasis on argumentative writing, argumentative speaking, argumentative thinking. It's one of the keys, and teachers need to make it socially acceptable to have kids have respectful debates with each other, and they can start that at a really early age. Again, excuse me, and that means teachers and administrators who model effective and respectful disagreement with one another and consideration of different points of view. I would argue that should take place in the boardroom as well. Respectful disagreements, comparison of alternatives, and then coming together. Those are, you asked me to address the issue of what I think high-impact conversations might be. So improved coaching with a high level of specificity, a greater level of focus, an emphasis on feedback, whether that feedback is for students, teachers, or administrators, and modeling critical thinking, innovation, and creativity. If I could pick 4 things for you to consider for high-impact conversations, that would be a pretty good start. So you've been kind enough to listen to me for 20 minutes. I'd like to stop and listen to you and receive your challenges and questions.
So, Dr. Reeves, I'm going to get us kicked off by doing a little sound check from the back of the room. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine, thank you.
Okay, so the first question that I have is, can you give us some examples of what you used to think and what you now think?
Gosh, does this mean you're not going to invite me back then?
Well, it depends on your answer.
Okay. You ask a straight question, you deserve a straight answer. But let me give you 3 very specific examples. I was a strong believer in learning styles, in auditory, kinesthetic, and visual learning styles. My dissertation advisor years ago was a strong believer in that. I read the literature, I trusted her, and I wrote about it and believed it. In more recent years, authors such as Daniel Willingham, John Hattie, and others have completely debunked that. To be clear, we should all teach in a variety of different manners, using movement, using audio and visual cues. However, the idea that we can label a kid as one of those things is simply wrong. All the reliability studies show that a kid who's visual one day can be kinesthetic the next, and so on. Moreover, studies that say if the label were true and we teach to a visual kid in a visual way, he'll have better performance than he would have otherwise, again turn out not to be true. This is not just one study. These are multiple studies, meta-analyses, preponderance of the evidence. It turns out not to be true. And that, honestly, is telling a lot of people who believe that, like the tooth fairy isn't true. But wait, it gets worse. If I ask most people, how do you get students to engage in creativity? The most frequent answer that I get is brainstorming. Brainstorming also turns out to not be true. Brainstorming is not a research-based strategy. It was started in 1946 by an advertising company executive named Alec Osborne. He sold 2 million books, but never had a lick of research. Brainstorming was undermined first in a 1960 study, 1960 at Yale University. Many studies since then have undermined it, most recently at MIT. That said, it doesn't mean that creative thinking doesn't have a place. But instead of getting the whole group together and inspiring each other and encouraging each other, no evaluation, anything goes, that was the traditional brainstorming. The best way to do brainstorming is first work alone. Work alone to generate the ideas and think of responses. Then all the ideas get put up, and that way people don't censor themselves. The second thing that MIT-style brainstorming is different from the 1940s brainstorming is evaluation is okay. It's completely acceptable, even necessary, to have evaluation and then a winnowing of the focus. You can start with large quantity, but a focus on evaluation and quality is essential. The best scientific studies on this come from the University of Pennsylvania as well as MIT, where they basically had groups addressing the same problem using traditional brainstorming and the type of brainstorming that I just discussed, and the second type had not only a higher level of quality, but a higher level of endurance and a better level of evaluation by independent experts. So learning styles, brainstorming, and those are probably a couple of good examples just to set the stage without my embarrassing myself anymore. I'm just trying to be honest about things that I used to think were true, but I've learned with research were not true.
Other questions?
I would be very curious if the audience is willing to learn about ways that you're emphasizing creativity in schools and how you're making the bridge from our missions to improve creativity and collaboration and critical thinking to actual classroom activities. I'm really a sponge for this, so if you'd be willing to share some of your successes about that, I'd sure appreciate it.
Well, I think I can chime in just a little. In Kentucky, the framework for teaching, which comes from Danielson's work, that there's certainly in the rubric much more language around students and student engagement in the work and students leading the conversation, self-reflecting. I'm trying to, off the top of my head, but just on that continuum of what is maybe better practice in a classroom, I do think that feedback to teachers around how to move that classroom lesson in a more engaging way, so it's a more of a minds-on classroom for students, has certainly helped the conversation in my district and helped teachers maybe see the teaching process in a way that when you really truly do get students more critical thinking happens, they're engaged in that process, or they are leading a learning process with their classmates, or in some formalized way that you move the quality of what's going on for kids in that environment. And so I would say that one tool for us has really been that rubric in the framework that has kind of changed some of the teachers' thought around what highly effective student learning looks like day in, day out.
That is such an important point, and if I could just add one little footnote to that, it is when it comes time to document the evidence behind teacher evaluation, my observation, and this may not be true in Kentucky, is that way too much of the documentation are teacher-created work products, lesson plans, assessments, and things like that. When, as you suggest, a more effective set of artifacts and evidence would be what the students are doing, including, I would argue, videos of students engaged in self-reflection, examples of student work that actually demonstrates improvement over an iterative process. And I think we really need to coach teachers and students that we're not looking for pretty 3-ring binders full of adult-created artifacts. We want to see what the kids are doing. Same goes when we do classroom observations. Dick Elmore says, you look down. The tendency is to look up at what the teacher is doing. But what we want to do is look down and hunker down next to a student. And just as you suggested, focus on what they're doing.
If superintendents are interested in promoting a growth mindset with their lead administrators, building level administrators, how might that conversation around any given group of topics, how might that conversation sound different when you're more focused and you're trying to coach and I'll just stop there and ask you to respond to that.
Yes, sir. There are 2 specific things that I think we can do to encourage a growth mindset. And this, by the way, is true in coaching administrators, excuse me, but also it applies to encouraging growth mindsets among students. Number 1, I think that at least half of our evaluation and observations of classrooms and of administrators must be non-evaluative. They're feedback only. So we're not using electronic devices. We're not entering things into some database. It's just feedback. It's the way that a great athletic coach or a great, nobody conducts the orchestra with a red pen. It's just feedback. I think that ought to be half the conversations, half the observations. The second thing is recognizing that we do have an obligation to make multiple observations and to have the data systems is to ban the use of the average. So if you want me to have a growth mindset right now in September, then you can't punish me in May for the mistakes that I make in September. We can't say, well, Doug, we want you to be bold and take risks. And then I do it and fall flat on my face, because that's what risk-taking is all about, is making some mistakes. Then what I need is some feedback about how to engage more effectively in whatever that challenge was, and have you as my boss observe that I'm getting better and better and better, and reward me for the growth, not punish me by the use of the average. Same is true for principals observing teachers. The use of average and multiple evaluations is deadly. No teacher will ever take a risk, and I argue the same is true in the classroom. We've got to stop using the average, because that is the opposite of a growth mindset.
Thank you.
Other questions? Oh.
You talked about this some, but would you talk just a little bit more about the importance of feedback? So I'm a superintendent, and I'm sitting with a principal, or I've been with them on a classroom visit. We're now back in the lounge, and we're having conversation non-evaluative. But what does that feedback conversation sound like? How does it sound different, maybe, than we used to think?
Yes, sir. I think it begins with specific questions, because one of the elements of feedback I said a minute ago was specificity, and I really appreciate, and you already have anticipated the timely part. You're right after the observation. You're back in the principal's office, so I think the key is before that observation, I would ask, what are you going to be looking for? And after the observation, I would say, what did you see? And so these are very brief, very focused questions, but I'm expecting specific answers. And if I get an answer like, well, it looked like I'm going to be looking for feedback, and looked like the feedback was pretty good, and I would probe to say, okay, I need to understand what that means. What exactly did you see? And show me how you're going to give feedback to that teacher in a way that is sufficiently specific to make it go from pretty good to real good. And I find that a lot of those conversations in many classroom observations are very ambiguous. And one of the reasons is that even though we've been talking about instructional leadership for a long time, a lot of our principals need some help on what good instruction looks like. And they need some help on what good coaching conversation looks like. And they need to feel empowered to tell the most veteran teacher in the school, here's how they can get better. So I think it's crisp, short questions and modeling the conversation about what they're going to tell the teachers, because that's how we can help principals to be more effective. The other thing that I would encourage is when the superintendent comes by, they're most likely to show you their best classes. And that's important because I don't think we observe our very best teachers enough. But I think you also need to be in there looking at first-year teachers or a veteran teacher who is struggling. So we look at a spectrum of those. So you get a feel for whether or not the principal is really differentiating in a specific way from the highest to the middle to the lowest levels of performance. And then I guess the final question is the now what? So you've told me that you want some things to get better. Help me understand how you're going to coach that teacher. So when I'm back here in 3 weeks, what should I expect to see differently?
Dr. Reeves?
Yes, sir.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on focus when thinking about administrators, principals in the building, about prioritizing 6 or fewer things? Is there a process or a suggestion you have in terms of how to take some of those things off the plate when we're constantly being asked to add things back on?
Yeah, I think we need to differentiate between the documentation that sometimes state requires in terms of school improvement plans and district improvement plans that typically have dozens and dozens of things that we're supposed to have on there, and the reality of day-to-day leadership observations where I think we can get down to 6. So I'm not, it's not possible to tear up the traditional school plan format, although I will tell you that some states have. I've written in an earlier book that Freeport, Illinois has a page and a plan. There's a district plan on 1 page, school plans on 1 page. So it can be done. But I grant that in many places there are administrative requirements for plans that have lots of things. That said, I think just as I think we can narrow the Danielson framework is, as we know, pretty huge. I think not everything in there is equally important. And it's important for principals to identify the few things that they're going to over-observe and over-emphasize rather than just going through the booklet for every page. Similarly, in coaching principals, I think it's important to say, colleagues, this year, you can expect that every time we have a conversation, I'm going to be asking you about literacy. I'm going to be asking you about student attendance. I'll be asking you about feedback. And then you may add your own. You may say safety or parent engagement. But, I think there shouldn't be more than about a half a dozen things that they know you're going to be asking about every single time. So I realize that there are oftentimes strategic plans and state requirements that go way beyond that. But it's really important that people know what your priorities are.
Is there, in your research anywhere, is there a evidence that one particular time frame for those conversations is better than another? I know you alluded a couple of times to 3 weeks, and I'm not saying it should be exactly 3 weeks. I'm just wondering if there's research to back the fact that if I engage my principals in that kind of conversation, how often is too often, how often is not often enough? Is there anything out there that tells us that?
Yes, sir. I want to offer a couple of observations. Number one, this burden should not be exclusively on the superintendent. When I observed a school system that won the Broad Award, one of the remarkable things about them is that the superintendent required that the central office staff had 80% of their time, 4 out of 5 days or 6 out of 8 hours, were in the, or I guess that's 75%, about 6.25 hours out of 8, were in schools. And I think really effective central offices spend a lot of time in schools. If they're going to convene a meeting, instead of pulling people out of the building, come to the central office, they're having a meeting in the schools, which even if people from other schools are coming, there's great value in people from other schools seeing what's going on in a neighboring school. So that's one idea. It's not all on your back. And the second answer is, it's not one size fits all. There are principals who need help every single week, and they need help on the basics. And I'm talking about scheduling, teacher feedback, dealing with angry parents. They need that support before it becomes a crisis, and they need to hear the message from the superintendent loud and clear. Bad news does not improve with age. I want to know what's going on before there's a crisis and coach you on how to anticipate that. There are other people for whom once every 4 weeks would be fine. What you don't hear me saying is, even for your most effective principals, is wait until the end of the year or wait until the end of the semester. What happens is that we tend to spend almost all of our energies on underperforming people, when that leads us to lower the bar because we forget what great performance looks like. So it's really important at least once a month to be in the buildings of your most effective people, so you know what spotlessly clean, always, and well-behaved kids and on-task teachers and students look like, so people simply can't tell you that it's impossible to get it done.
Any more questions? Any other thoughts? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Reeves. I know you're coming up on the end time, so thank you again for being with us today, for having this conversation, for helping to improve our skills and working with others. We tremendously appreciate your time that you've given us.
Well, it's my great pleasure, and what I would like to request is that you'll see at the bottom of my one-page handout is my email. I answer emails from around the world, from superintendents and principals and teachers. I want you to know that you can count on my colleagues at Creative Leadership Solutions and me as a resource. We have a number of free resources, including videos and documents that we're very happy to share. When people are sometimes doing book studies, I'm happy to do a video conference like this with your senior team or your faculty, whatever you think is appropriate. So please don't wait for just meetings like this. No matter how small the district is, we really take an interest in you, and we are very happy to be a part of your journey.